So this is our third video on give and take, and it's on chapter 3, and it's called The Ripple Effect. So this chapter is really about the difference between geniuses and genius makers, and the different ripple effects that they have on their peers based on whether they are givers or matchers or takers. So most of us think most of the time that, oh, wow, it would be great to have, a genius around working on the project, and it can be. The only problem is that geniuses often, according to Grant's research, are in it for themselves, not necessarily intentionally, but they get focused on their own abilities and what they can accomplish, and not on how the group is doing. And so that often triggers the sort of latent resentment people have for people who have more ability than they, and those people get upset with the genius, and the whole group doesn't function very well, and thus doesn't accomplish as much as they could. And so his analysis here is going to be about how do you get around that problem. Not surprisingly, Grant's analysis is going to focus on having a giver's attitude toward working with others as opposed to a matcher's or a taker's. So a genius who also is a giver, he calls a genius maker. And probably the single most important aspect of a genius maker is that the genius maker values interdependence rather than independence. So matchers and takers tend to have a general bias toward understanding independence as strength and interdependence as weakness, right? And you can kind of understand the logic of that. If you could do it yourself, that shows that you're strong. If you rely on somebody else, then that means you're weaker, right? We can understand the logic of that. But it's important to flip that around and view it from the giver's point of view and the genius maker's point of view. From their point of view, the group always collectively knows more than any individual in it by definition. And so the genius maker, the giver, is trying to figure out how do you link these people and collaborate in such a way that the totality of that knowledge becomes available for everyone. And you're not just reliant on the view of the genius, right? That the collective genius is always greater than the individual genius, and it's just a matter of how do you tap the collective genius. The second trait that givers show in their collaborative strategy is to exhibit what we call expedition behavior. It's a term from wilderness programs. Grant defines expedition behavior as involving putting the group's goals and mission first and showing the same amount of concern for others as you do for yourself. So the logic is you're on this expedition, you're out there with all these other people, you depend on them, and it's not just about your own skill. Like the expedition needs to succeed for you to be able to succeed. And so some of your energy has to be put into making sure that the expedition goes well. The better the expedition goes, the better your own trip will go, and that's why it's rational to exhibit this behavior. Givers succeed in their collaboration strategy in a third way, in that they earn idiosyncrasy credits. Idiosyncrasy credits are positive impressions that accumulate in the minds of group members. So here you are acting in a way that doesn't necessarily make sense from a selfish rationality perspective, and people pick up on this, right? Over time, they start giving you credit for the ways that you help them in ways where you're going above and beyond the call of what they might do. And so here they are naturally suspicious of a genius, but now the genius is helping them and not acting like a selfish genius, but a genius giver, and is racking up these credits. So the two main ways that they work are lowering suspicion of coworkers and thus allowing the status quo to be challenged. because people generally like to do things the way they've gone before, and they're suspicious of somebody who might be changing those ways to benefit him or herself. But here, if you've shown yourself to be for the group and you've been generous as a giver, then they allow the status quo to get challenged more, which allows improvement to happen more. Another way that givers' collaboration strategies work is that they promote psychological safety. Grant defines psychological safety as the belief that you can take a risk without being penalized or punished. So you could see how if a giving tone, if a generous tone pervades a room, then you could speak your mind and be wrong or have an idea that fails, and then the people aren't going to pounce on you because you've sort of displayed weakness, right? That's not the attitude in the room. If you're a taker, then you would try to undermine somebody for being wrong and get a step ahead of them, right? But a giver would say, okay, that didn't work, and then here we go on, and maybe we could do it better this way next time. And so when the room is psychologically safe, then people can express their ideas more freely, and you have more options as to how to go forward. So still another reason that givers' collaboration strategies work is that they are capable of overcoming responsibility bias. Grant defines responsibility bias as exaggerating our own contributions relative to others' inputs. So, in other words, responsibility bias is the tendency of people to take more credit than they actually are due in a project. And obviously that could alienate all the other people in the project. And so it turns out that takers and matchers are more likely to have responsibility bias, and givers are less likely to have it. As Grant writes, the takers blamed their partners for failures and claimed credit for successes. The givers shouldered the blame for failures and gave their partners more credit for successes. Again, over time, this generates so much goodwill that the group can do better. So you lower the temperature in the room, and people start feeling that they don't all need to be scrapping for whatever success that the endeavor has, thus alienating others and leading the group to not do as well as they could have otherwise. Yet another way that givers collaborate well, they traverse what Grant calls the perspective gap. As he defines it, when we're not experiencing a psychologically or physically intense state, we dramatically underestimate how much it will affect us. That's the perspective gap. He goes on, research shows that when we take others' perspectives, we tend to stay within our own frames of reference, asking, how would I feel in this situation? When we're giving a gift, we imagine the joy that we would experience. So this is, if you remember his example from the book, it's like, well, I like broccoli, so I'll give this person broccoli, even though this person doesn't like broccoli. Like, I like broccoli, so broccoli's a good, and I'll try to do good by somebody else by giving them broccoli. So the perspective gap is that problem when you stay within your own frame of reference, as opposed to really empathetically and compassionately owning the experience of another person and figuring out that they might want something that's actually different from what you want. As Grant writes, in collaborations, takers rarely cross this perspective gap. They're so focused on their own viewpoints that they never end up seeing how others are reacting to their ideas and feedback. On the other hand, researcher Jim Barry and I discovered that in creative work, givers are motivated to benefit others, so they find ways to put themselves in other people's shoes. He goes on, speaking of somebody who can cross the perspective gap, this made him more empathetic and considerate, helping other people to simmer down from intense states and accept his revisions. So this example is about helping somebody accept criticism, right? You have to criticize somebody, and do you give that criticism in a way that wouldn't bother you, Or do you think about the particular vulnerabilities of that particular person and how that criticism might come across? The more empathy and compassion you have, and the more ways you can alter and strategically fit that criticism into an acceptable form for that particular person, the better that criticism's effect will actually be on the group's project. So George Meyer is one of the main writers for The Simpsons. And here are his 4 rules that he lives by to form his code. Show up, work hard, be kind, and take the high road. Not exactly rocket science, but worth noting. So it might help us to circle back to the beginning where he's talking about the difference between geniuses and genius makers to look at his discussions of George Meyer and Frank Lloyd Wright. So George Meyer would be his example of a genius maker. He's a genius who's also a giver. And so he does all the things we talked about and has those collaboration strategies and reciprocation strategies and brings out the best in other people, brings out the genius of the whole group. Right, that's the key to the genius maker. He makes the group a bigger genius even than he is. Whereas Frank Lloyd Wright, very very famous architect, is a genius without being a genius maker. He has hundreds and hundreds of interns and apprentices and all that over the years. Almost none of those people go on to make it big on their own, which is odd, right? But not when you look at it, because Frank Lloyd Wright is sort of sucking the life out of them in order to push his own fame, whereas George Meyer is building up these other people to bring out the genius in them and in the whole group to make The Simpsons a huge success, and then so many of his people then go on to great careers of their own. And so that's the difference between a genius maker and a mere genius. So takeaways for this video, you should be very familiar with the list of the elements of how genius maker givers collaborate. So they value interdependence, they exhibit expedition behavior, they earn idiosyncrasy credits, they promote psychological safety, they overcome responsibility bias, they traverse the perspective gap, and so also think of exactly what's going on with George Meyer versus Frank Lloyd Wright and geniuses versus genius makers.